In the mid-80s, the young Frank Miller was hired by DC Comics to write a story about Batman. The idea was to give the character a new direction, one that took a much darker path than the public was used to in those years. For this, Miller wanted to pose a simple question through a comic. What would happen if Bruce Wayne continued to fight crime at 50 years old? This was the basis of the comic The Dark Knight Returns, a story that today is considered by many as the best Batman comic, and a story that inspired many other adventures in which we see a broken hero return from retirement to face the world's evil once again. However, the world they return to is very different from the one they experienced when they were young. Often it's a much more violent place, where most of the heroes have died, are retired, or were defeated by the forces that opposed them. While The Dark Knight is not the first story to tell us about a dystopian future, or the first comic to show us the life of a superhero after retirement, they certainly are watershed moments in comic history, inspiring many other stories to follow in their footsteps. The question is, what is it about these stories of broken heroes that we find so attractive and interesting? That's what we're going to analyze today, because it turns out these stories follow a very specific pattern. There are many stories of this kind, but in this video we will focus on 5 in particular: The Dark Knight Returns, Spider-Man Reign, Old Man Logan, The Last Ronin #1, and finally Kingdom Come. I'm Go, the Geek Monitor, and today we'll analyze the archetype of the broken hero. Go, the Geek Monitor! That's right. If you have any doubts about the course, let's dive into the topic now. Superhero comics, particularly with heroes like Batman or Spider-Man, present us with a world where these characters seem not to age. That is, if we read the Batman comics from DC's central continuity, we will read adventures of a character who always seems to be in his 30s or 40s. It's true that there are some events, like Peter Parker's wedding to Mary Jane, that give us the idea that their lives are moving forward, but the reality is that we will never see these characters age too much in the central continuity of their universes because they are extremely popular characters that need to stay relevant. Initially, this is an important part of the appeal of these old man type stories, the fact that they allow us to take a look beyond the time bubble in which these characters seem to find themselves, and that's why these stories regularly take place in alternate universes, where the writers have complete freedom to go down paths that the central continuity simply wouldn't allow. And these futures they often present to us are extremely bleak. Initially, these comics tell us that the central hero of the story is broken, and this, in part, is due to the fact that at some point in the story he suffered a great personal loss that led him to decide that this heroic struggle they were carrying out was not worth it, that we simply are not worth it. To give some examples, Spider-Man accidentally caused cancer to Mary Jane, Wolverine fell into the illusion of mystery and killed his fellow X-Men, Batman retired when Robin was killed by Joker, Mikey lost his brothers, and finally Superman also lost Lois Lane at the hands of Joker. However, losing a loved one is not enough to break a hero. What really breaks these characters seems to be the realization that they are in a fight that is impossible to win. All these characters I mentioned have faced evil time and time again. And throughout the comics we see them triumph even in times when it seems like they won't. But if we think about it, it makes sense that in the future there will be a battle that they will not be able to win, and what breaks these characters is not the fact of having lost the battle, but the realization that they will never be able to win the war. In the comic Kingdom Come, Joker kills Lois Lane and the entire team of the Daily Planet. Superman and Batman roam the city. However, a new hero named Magog finds him first, and instead of letting the police take him to jail, he kills him in cold blood. In this story, Superman takes Magog to trial for murdering the Joker. Unfortunately for the Man of Steel, Magog is released, and at that moment Superman realizes that he no longer represents the values of the world and self-exiles in his fortress of solitude. If you notice, it's not the death of Lois Lane that breaks the Man of Steel, but the fact that he feels he lost the war for the soul of humanity. Logan, on the other hand, after the death of his X-Men companions, seems to realize that the cycle of violence is one that never ends. And that's why he decides to adopt a peaceful life with his new family and swears never to use his claws again. In these stories, the broken heroes make an attempt to integrate into society and regularly do so by following the rules in a submissive way, let's say trying not to stand out from the crowd. On one hand, Peter Parker works in a flower shop where his boss is an idiot and the customers treat him badly. Logan works on his farm and endures the abuse of Hulk's sons. And on the other hand, Bruce Wayne becomes an alcoholic because he thinks it's the only way to tame the bad spirit within him. In this case, he knows he couldn't stay silent unless there's something to numb his senses and this thirst for justice he's felt since the day he lost his parents. What is a fact is that none of these characters are really happy with their new life. They often harbor resentments and secretly long for their glory years, but they desperately struggle to adapt to this new world because they think it's the best option in the long run. Fortunately for us, this first part of these stories where our character does everything possible to fit in with the world doesn't last long, as there is always an event that forces them to take up their mantle again. We have already talked about a literary device called the hero's journey on other occasions, but in summary, it is a narrative structure that follows many stories around the world, from mythological tales like Gilgamesh to sagas like Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings, where we see the hero at the beginning of the story in their ordinary world. Then, they receive a call to adventure, face great trials and dangers, and finally return to their world, but transformed by the journey they have lived through. This has worked very well for centuries, and we humans love to see these kinds of stories. But the comics of the Broken Hero present us with a very unique variation of this theme. At the beginning of these stories, we see how the Broken Hero does his best to fit into his new world. However, there is an event that calls him back to adventure. In the case of Batman in The Dark Knight Returns, it's Harvey Dent, better known as Two-Face, escaping from the police. In the case of Logan, it's Hawkeye offering him a job with which he can get the money he needs to pay the rent, and in the case of Peter Parker, it's James Jonah Jameson visiting him, giving him a stored Spider-Man mask and asking him to return to save the city from being trapped inside a force field along with an army of hungry Venoms. All these examples serve as a new call to adventure. But here this resource is used in a very different way, since in all these cases the protagonist has already gone through this hero's journey once. In theory, each of these characters has already overcome all their heroic trials and returned home transformed, but they did not get that happy ending that these stories often propose, so none of them see the point in starting this cycle again. However, they all eventually accept this call to adventure again. But when they return to this world of heroes versus villains, they soon realize that things are no longer the same as before. The first thing to note is that these heroes are not at their peak physical capacity. The years have passed, and with them, their abilities have diminished. Bruce repeatedly states in the comic that he escaped various situations by sheer luck. And Spider-Man has to be smarter when facing villains, as his arachnid powers are not what they used to be. On the other hand, Superman presents us with a completely different case. In Kingdom Come, he is much more powerful than before because he has spent years storing solar energy. However, if you notice, both resources serve to increase the tension within the story. In Batman and Spider-Man, it's about physically limiting them so that defeat feels more imminent. And in the case of Superman, it's about making him doubt when to act and when not to, since the story revolves around a Superman who lost his sense of morality and no longer knows what is right. It is then the fact that he has more power makes him more dangerous. Another thing these stories have in common is that the heroes tend to have darker and more violent personalities, which are the result of years of repressing their heroic side and the losses they have suffered over time. In the comic The Last Running, for example, we no longer see Mikey as this cheerful character who makes jokes, but as a turtle who is willing to do anything to avenge the death of his brothers, or ceremonially end his life in case of failure. In fact, he imagines the voices of his brothers, and it is they who do make some jokes as if they were stranded in another era, as it is the memory that Mikey has of them. In these stories, we not only see what happened to the heroes a long time later, but we also meet old allies and enemies who are regularly in a completely different place. A particularity of these stories is the fact that they regularly present us with a future in which the villains finally win, and they achieve this by defeating the heroes, either by force or in much more subtle ways. In Old Man Logan, for example, the villains of the world agree to carry out a coordinated attack in which, after several battles, they manage to defeat most of Marvel's superheroes, and Red Skull becomes president, so Logan is practically alone in his fight against the Hulk family. The Dark Knight, on the other hand, does not tell us in that comic what happened to the other heroes, with the exception of Green Arrow and Superman. But the sequel does tell us that many superheroes were gradually and quietly incapacitated by villains like Lex Luthor and Brainiac, in such a way that the world simply began to forget about them little by little. Kingdom Come, for its part, tells us that there is a secret organization of villains made up of characters like Vandal Savage and again Lex Luthor, who are responsible for destabilizing governments from the shadows. The point here is that the writers always present us with a future in which the heroes are ultimately defeated, and this not only has a consequence for the central heroes of the story, but also for their former allies. In Spider-Man Reign, for example, Jameson is presented as a millionaire who sold his newspaper a long time ago, but who today realizes the lack of truth in the modern world and decides that the only person capable of saving the city is the hero who he spent years defaming. Logan, on the other hand, encounters a Hawkeye who is already blind and traffics drugs from time to time. Like everyone else, he is a character who had to adapt to new times in the absence of other heroes. But this doesn't always happen in the best way. A very clear example of this is seen in the comic The Dark Knight Strikes Again, which tells us that Dick Grayson became a sort of superhero killer with the appearance of Joker. Kingdom Come, on the other hand, also presents us with a series of characters who have lost their way, from an extremely violent Wonder Woman to characters like John Jones, who is now afraid to read human thoughts because he realized the cruelty to which we can aspire. And it is that, just as times change, there are some characters who manage to adapt better than others. That is, while some adopt a much darker approach to life, others cling to the values of the past. And the same happens with the new characters that these stories present to us. Characters who regularly adopt the name of a hero or villain from the past, but do not always adopt their same ideology. A very clear case of this is with Carrie Kelly, who claims the mantle of Robin and helps Batman, even though at the beginning of the story she is not trained. She simply wants to be there for Bruce because she believes in the values that he represents, heroic values of another generation. A contrary case can be seen in the character of Ashley Barton, Hawkeye's daughter, who carries the emblem of Spider-Woman, but in the comic we can see that she has very different values than those the Avengers or her grandfather Peter Parker represented. In fact, this conflict between two generations of superheroes can be seen at its highest expression in the comic Kingdom Come, in which the whole story has to do precisely with past heroes facing the inevitable future and trying to recover heroic values in a world that seems to have lost them with the new generation of meta-humans. I think that in the end these stories are particularly attractive to us because deep down we are not very optimistic about the future, as it is a concept that can seem terrifying to us. That is, the end of our life is there, and the twilight of these characters makes us think that depending on the decisions we make today will depend on our last years, and if these characters who cheated death so many times are capable of failing, what prevents us from failing? However, these stories also have a positive side, the fact that at one point, the central character reconnects with his essential values and is transformed once again by the adventure he has just undertaken, even though he believed that this was no longer possible. Our hero dies, is reborn, and becomes the character he once was again. It is interesting then that even though these stories have a dark tone, they usually end with a cautious optimism in which even they perceive their future with a certain brightness. And despite the fact that they seem like these unreachable and fantastic characters, at certain moments, particularly in these stories, they also seem like extremely human characters. And if they can face the future, I suppose we can try it too. Don't go yet. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to my channel where I make video essays where I take comics very seriously. And if you want to vote for the topics of the new videos, remember to follow me on Instagram, since in the stories is where I do the voting. That's all for today. I am Go, and keep looking beyond the obvious.